Hi everyone. So this is my third Booker Prize long list video, and I want to talk today about Ali Smith's Autumn, which I read yesterday. And this is a book that I had almost no background on. So Ali Smith is a name I know vaguely. I've never read anything by her before. I don't really know much about her other than that she floats around in the literary scene as one of those writers whose books people notice. I don't know why, I've never got around to reading her. So Autumn I came to pretty cold in terms of expectations. That said, it wasn't what I expected. So what I expected was a topical political novel, a post-Brexit novel, which is how it's been reviewed, how it's been mentioned in the snippets that I've heard and seen in newspaper reviews and that sort of thing. And it's and I'll talk a bit about what it was billed as, and also how I found it. I have to say I found it a slightly confusing novel. And I'll talk about why that's the case. But anyway, let's jump in. So it is a post-Brexit novel, and I'll talk a bit about the timing of the novel, because I think that's important at the end when I've given you some other views. It does have a post-Brexit theme. There is a mention of the murder of the Labour MP Jo Cox. There is a mention of how people felt waking up the morning after the referendum and the divisions that resulted in across the UK. There's also a section where a couple of Spanish holidaymakers arrive in the UK on holiday and are told that they should go back to their country because even Spanish holidaymakers apparently are not welcome anymore. So there are bits of Brexit theme, and I understand why the media has picked that up. That said, this is not really what this novel is about at all. So two main characters, Elizabeth, who is a 0 hours contract lecturer in art history, and is, I guess, I don't know, 30 or so. And an elderly man, Daniel Gluck, who is in a care home dying, and he was Elizabeth's next door neighbour when she was a child. And she has come back. He meant so much to her in her childhood that she has come back and is visiting him a couple of times a week in this care home. And really the story focuses on these two characters. Daniel, as far as I can see, has no knowledge of the post-Brexit referendum stage. He's no longer able to talk. What we get of his character is a sort of drifting out in and out of internal confusion and maybe delirium, but it's purely internal. So it's all from his point of view and his experiences of being nearly dying and the dreams or the mental stuff that's going around for him as he's nearly dying. And then for Elizabeth, we get parts of her daily life with her mother, with various activities that she is doing as she goes around. She's getting a passport renewed. She's trying to register at a GP surgery. And also she is sitting by Daniel's bed in the care home, pretending to be his granddaughter, reading to him and thinking about their life together. So it's really quite a touching story of this relationship between this elderly man and a young girl who felt very unloved by the mother that she was living with. And that I found, as I say, touching and interesting. It's a complicated book, and it's a very ambitious book. And for me, it doesn't quite work. So and let me talk a little bit about why that's the case. So it's complicated in terms of structure. So as I said, we've got Daniel's sections which are completely shut off from ongoing current reality because he's dying and doesn't know what's going on. We've got Elizabeth in the present. We've also got Elizabeth's memories of her childhood with Daniel. We have brief narratorial explanations of things which Elizabeth apparently doesn't remember, but which the narrator is able to tell us about. So sort of precise memories of the past. So we have sort of part dream bits. We have memory. We have present reality. We have things that the narrator knows that nobody else knows. We also have, towards the end, a slightly weird addition of a section in the life of a 60s female pop artist whom Elizabeth is studying because she's an art lecturer, but we suddenly switch into her experience of life and being a female pop artist in the 60s. So there's all of these different pieces going on. It's never explained particularly clearly how these fit together, which is fine. Except that it's not quite clear to me how they fit together. It doesn't form an obvious cohesive whole. So there's a structural piece, which is, as I said, complicated, ambitious. I'm never quite sure how all of the pieces fit together. And then the narrator jumps in periodically with her comments on Brexit. So there's a structural piece. There's also a linguistic piece. So it is a clearly literary, slightly experimental book. It starts off as Daniel's stream of consciousness. The novel opens with Daniel on a beach somewhere, unsure whether he is dead or alive, wandering around, picking up leaves, sewing them into a coat. And then finding himself on a Mediterranean beach where refugees are washing up dead, and at the same time there are holidaymakers lying there in the sun. And then it becomes clear later on that he is in fact in this sort of dreamlike near-dead state in his care home. So the language is very fragmentary at that point. It also at other points becomes very deliberately rhetorical. So there's a section post-Brexit where for about a page and a half we get all over the country people were rejoicing, all over the country people were distressed, all over the country people didn't know what was going on, all over the country people were celebrating, and that sort of sentence pattern continues for a page and a half. It's also at times quite realist language. So we get a number of pages where Elizabeth is talking to a man in the post office as she tries to get her passport renewed, and then later in the novel we get the same thing again with a woman in the post office because first time round the passport renewal didn't work. And this is a very pedestrian, detailed description of their interaction with no obvious artistic shaping to it at all. And these different linguistic styles sort of flit in and out, again, with no particular obvious reason why we've got one at any stage rather than another. I quite liked the stuff in Daniel's head, the stream of consciousness stuff. The realist experiences of Elizabeth didn't really work for me. If you're going to write something that is that detailed and that specific, it also needs to be really, really well written. And I just didn't think the quality of the writing at any stage was enough to hold up the bittiness and the decisions Smith was making in terms of what she was including. So linguistically, it was sort of fragmentary, but without being poetic. That didn't quite work for me. And then the other interesting thing that's going on here is it's a very erudite novel in terms of its literary allusions, some of which are more obvious than, or some of which it's easier to understand than others. So from the very beginning, Elizabeth is reading Brave New World. So we have this sort of clunking, very significant allusion that this is not all it seems. This supposed Brave New World is not all it seems to be, and it's drawing very much on sort of Huxley's dystopian picture. We also get references as we go through to James Joyce's short stories for no particular reason that I could understand. We also get a load of allusions which, as I was going through, thought, hang on, that sounds a bit like The Tempest. You get Daniel at some point feels as though he's shut up in a pine tree, which is true of Caliban in The Tempest. So it's sort of, I began to pick up there was something about The Tempest here. And as you go through, eventually that becomes explicit, and Daniel and Elizabeth go and see a performance of The Tempest together. And that is clearly intended to be significant. There's also references, as I said, to 60s pop art. There are references a lot to metamorphosis. I didn't quite understand why that was relevant, but people are constantly dealing with metamorphosing. So some of it is relevant to the political context of the novel. Some of it isn't. I thought actually the Tempest references worked relatively well. And I just want to read you one paragraph of where these were finally explained, because I do think that this is quite an interesting parallel to the political context that the novel is talking about. So Elizabeth and Daniel, towards the end of the novel, it's revealed that they once went to a performance of The Tempest together, after all of these illusions all the way through. So this is Elizabeth's view as a child. It was really good, about a father and a daughter. It was also about fairness and unfairness, and people getting hypnotised on an island and hatching plots against each other to see who could take control of the island. And some characters were meant to be the slaves, and other characters got to be freed. But mostly it was about a girl whose father, a magician, was sorting out her future for her. Now, Daniel is not Elizabeth's father, but in a sense he is a sort of magical character who is helping Elizabeth with her future. So that makes sense as a parallel. The point of people being hypnotised on an island and hatching plots against each other is quite a clear Brexit analogy, I think. So it sort of works, but it didn't entirely work for me. You're probably getting the impression as I talk about this that it's all a little bit vague and a little bit confused. That's how I feel like I'm coming across, and that was how the novel came across for me as well. So we've got this structural stuff, we've got some weird linguistic stuff, we've got this whole range of weird allusions. There are also allusions to the Second World War and to Nazis rounding up Jews in the south of France in 1943, and it's all a bit, let me remind you that people in Europe have turned against each other before, and this is what they're doing again now. It doesn't quite come together. I spent the first half of this book really just not getting it. By halfway through, I felt as though it was beginning to gather some effectiveness, and actually that was the point at which the narrative became more coherent. The characterization I was beginning to find more touching. The Elizabeth-Daniel relationship was really developing by then, and I did find that relationship very touching. And by the end, after this sort of weird British pop art 1960s interpolation, I did feel that I had got into it. So much so, actually, that I went back to the beginning of the novel as soon as I'd finished to sort of check, was it just me? Was I in the wrong mood when I started reading this? Or does it just not quite work? And my conclusion, having gone back again to the beginning, was actually, it just doesn't quite work. Which was a shame, because there's a load of really interesting stuff going on here. There is a really touching story going on at the core. There are some lovely scenes between Elizabeth and Daniel, but then there's just all of this other random allusion and political stuff, which to me just didn't really fit. And I do have a slight view on why this is the case, and it's to do with the timing with which the novel came out. So we're now in August 2017 as I read this. The Brexit referendum took place in June 2016, so just over a year ago. That means that in the course of that year, this novel was not only finished in terms of the Brexit stuff, which is relatively significant to the novel, so it took a reasonable amount of time to write, but also went through the editing process and the publishing process. And the publishing process usually takes, in my experience, about 18 months. So somebody has compressed the process here in order to get this book out. And that's a little bit what it felt like to me reading it. It felt as though Smith decided, I've got this novel about Elizabeth and Daniel. I'm imagining this. I've got this novel about Elizabeth and Daniel, and I can add some interesting Brexit stuff. So she did that. And then somebody rushed it through the editorial process, rushed it through the publishing process, and here it is. And it's a shame because, as I said, the themes are interesting. The writing in places is interesting. There are all of these fragments of stuff which could have been pulled together better. But to me, it just didn't feel cohesive. And I suspect that that is because somebody wanted to get it out. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. This is pure imagination. But that was how it felt to me. And so Ali Smith's Autumn, interesting, didn't feel finished. Not yet. So I've now read 4 of this list. I've read Solar Bones, I've read Reservoir 13, I've read Exit West, I've read Autumn. Autumn to me is the 3rd best of those 4 so far. So yes, let's wait and see what I think of the rest of the list.